We want to welcome you to this round rectangular table session. And we are here today to talk a little bit about the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health, and Social Justice. There will be some slides running throughout, so they'll be circulating. And so if you miss one, it'll come back around. And the slides are essentially giving you a snapshot of what it is that we've been doing together for some 6 years now. It's been, although that's not that's not when we formally formed, but that's when the kernel of the idea got started. I'm Allison Cohen, and I'm the one of the co-founders and the director of the National Right to Food Community in Practice, which is a US-based network organization that's really linking together and knitting together different efforts at local levels, whether it's city, region, state, knitting together these local efforts around framing policy and practice programs in terms of the right to food. So that is me. And I'm also a part of this Global Solidarity Alliance. I think that in a nutshell, this panel is really about scholar activism. I think what we'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how this all came together, and also talk about a little bit about what's the role of scholars and their work and their voices in continuing to dig down to the root causes and connect with each other and continually develop an evolving shared analysis about how we address the issue of hunger at its roots. So I'm going to start by just asking each of you, who are you? Please tell us your name, affiliation, and how you got connected to the GSA, which is our shorthand, and why, briefly.
So I'm Jan Poppendick. I'm a retired professor of sociology from Hunter College, City University of New York, and a senior faculty fellow at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And I am the author of Charity, Emergency Food and the End of Entitlement, and some other books, but that's the one that's mostly relevant for the rights, not charity discussion. And I got connected to this group when Kaylee invited me to come to a conference in England, in Birmingham. And I was thrilled to find a group of people who saw the world through the same peculiar lens that I had used. And it's been great to have company, sneaky boat.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So my name is Kaylee Garthwaite. I'm an associate professor of social policy at the University of Birmingham in the UK. I'm also a trustee of the Independent Food Aid Network I find in the UK, whose vision is a country without the need for charitable food aid and where adequate and nutritious food is affordable to everybody. Like John says, I'm also a co-founder of the GSA and have been involved since day one.
I'm Andy Fisher. I work for the third sector in England. I provide technical assistance for a USDA grant program. My connections, I've read a book, Learning a Lot from Jan, called Big Hunger. And I connected with Kaylee and others in the UK 7 years ago. And hope to start this.
Hi, I'm Alana Hainstein. I just recently finished my PhD at the University of California, Davis, and I'm going to be starting as an assistant professor of sociology at Creighton University in the fall. And I came to be part of this group. I was researching food bank CEOs, and someone put me in contact with Josh, and then to join the rest of the group.
I know we're encouraging you to talk to each other.
Oh yeah,
Raise your voices a little bit.
Hey everyone, I'm Charlie Spring. I'm currently based in what's now called Canada, where I'm doing a postdoc on some slightly different topics. But I read Jan's book in 2014 when I just started a PhD looking at the growth of surplus food redistribution in the UK and how that was being used as an excuse to expand food banking. Reading Jan's book made me realize I had to pay attention to the North American context. So I came and did a little bit of research then, but felt like there was nobody really talking about the cross-Atlantic learning potential. So when Kaylee announced her intention to be looking at this, I got in touch with Kaylee, and yeah, I've been more active since 2020, I guess, when a lot of us kind of got on board.
Hi everyone, my name is Josh Lonis. I'm a research assistant professor at West Virginia University. I had been studying food banking networks in West Virginia for my dissertation, which I defended in 2019, theorizing that food banks were spatial fixed to overproduction and accumulation of the capitalist system writ large, but the capitalist food system specifically. And then COVID hit like right after I was done defending and trying to figure out what is the learning, the action that's coming out of this. I was on a food justice scholar activist call for the AAGs in Denver, which had gone virtual, and re-met on the chat Charlie, who invited me to this call 3 days later. And it was lovely meeting everyone that I had wrestled with in their work, and Andy and Jan and Graham Riches as well. And a space for action, for turning our learning into action is what really inspired me to continue to build with these lovely people.
Jan, I'm gonna come back to you. You've been engaged in this work for over 4 years. Sorry to out you. What have you seen as the critique, charitable food accounts evolved with it?
So, to tell you a little story. After Sweet Charity was published, Larry Brown was teaching at the Friedman School at Tufts University, their nutrition program. And he invited me up to talk to his graduate students. And he introduced me as kind of like a skunk at a garden party. And it wasn't an insult, it was a tribute. But I want to talk a little bit about what's the garden party, and then I'll get to the skunk part. The garden party is the pleasure, the feeling good, the joy, and the relief that we feel when we can alleviate hunger with food that might otherwise have gone to waste. This, everybody loves a twofer, okay? But this twofer touches deeply held norms, beliefs, values that for most of us go back to childhood. I mean, I don't know if you remember the Clean Plate Club, but most of us were socialized not to waste in the home setting. And most of us were socialized to care about people in need and to respond in some way. And the capacity or the ability to touch both of these touchstones with a single act, whether it's a casual act of putting a can in a grocery store collection barrel, or whether it's the people who work long hours, week after week, month after month, now we're up to decade after decade, to try to respond to the needs of people. And I first began thinking about the relief that people feel when I was turning my doctoral dissertation into a book, a rite of passage that some of you may currently be engaged in or have added to. But that book was called Red Lines Needing Food Assistance in the Great Depression. And I undertook that study trying to understand how the food programs in the United States got so bad as they were when their sins were revealed to the public in an expose in the late 60s. But it took me a long while to write this book, dissertation. And while I was trying to figure out how they got so bad, advocates were making them much, much better. So that now food assistance, USDA has 14 food assistance programs, and 1 in every 4 Americans participates in at least one. This is a much larger contribution to support low-income families than welfare. So they're not great programs, but they're a lot better than a lot of programs that we have. But when I went back to look into the origins of this, I was very struck. The origins were an accident. The Department of Agriculture was trying to prevent a glut on the pork market, and so they offered to slaughter baby pigs. They invited farmers to send what are called unripe pigs and piggy sows, that's pregnant sow, to market and collect a bonus from the Department of Agriculture. And there was a public uproar. Okay, how can you be destroying this good food while people are going hungry? And so Roosevelt was no fool. He told his Secretary of Agriculture and his social emergency relief czar to get together and make a program to take the farmer surpluses and distribute them to people in need. That is actually the origins of the whole 14 program USDA food assistance empire. But what struck me was not up-in, but an editorial in the New York Times saying that it would not only provide relief to the farmer and to the hungry people, but that it would relieve our minds of the distressing paradox of want and plenty. And that's the seed of the concept that I developed in Sweet Charity of the moral safety. Seeing hunger when we're flooded with food makes us uncomfortable, and all of our creative and some of them quite wonderful food assistance, charitable food assistance programs relieve that distress. So that's the critique that has lingered with me. I think it's done for now.
And we'll all have time for questions. So if my back's to you, can you hear me okay? If I'm this loud, okay. Haley and Andy, two all together back in 2018 in Birmingham. Can you tell us a little bit about how would you describe the GSA and how it came together?
Yeah, I mean, so personalize it too much, but I had written a book called Big Hunger, which drew upon many of the lessons that Jen had written about my own frustration with the corporate capture of banking and the world in general. And maybe I can go to England on this. You know, maybe I get a little trip to England and do some book talks there. And I was surprised at the depth and the warmth of the people who want to hear about the United States. So I did that and connected a little bit with Kaylee and some of her colleagues at IFAN and maybe other organizations. So I think that led, you know, to that her invitations to have us there. I think what I also want to say, and I'll let you fill in the rest, is I think what I saw in the UK was this kind of fear that, you know, they could go down the American path in terms of the expansion of food banking. I mean, they had just been 10 years into this, and you know, food banks had a foothold there, and people were just shocked that what are these things that, you know, they're ungodly creations. So they wanted to see what they could learn from you know, our bad example, and then from our end, I mean, I think there's a little bit of like, oh my God, how can we help them not go down this path? But also, how can we search for new inspiration models? I felt the United States has been so jaded, this accepted emergency food system, food charity as kind of the norm. It's been so part of how we think, common sense is that, you know, the fact that places like Scotland and other places in the UK are trying to eliminate food banks and reject them as partisan. That was, to me, was just like, this is a fantastic model.
Yeah, so I've been researching food bank use in the UK since 2013. So food banks in the UK started to become a thing really around 2010. And I think 2013, when I started volunteering and researching in a Trussell Trust food bank, who was sort of the main food bank franchise in the UK. That was the first time that 1 million food parcels have been given out across their network. So it was sort of a bit of a shock, a bit of a wake-up call for people in the UK to think, oh, well, you know, where are we headed with this? So I was carrying out ethnographic research. Like I say, I was a volunteer and a researcher. Obviously, very inspired by Jen's move, Sweet Charity, which I actually read in one sitting when I was on a train that was delayed because there was a plastic bag stuck in the overhead wires. So I was stuck for like 5.5 hours outside of Doncaster in the UK, and I read Sweet Charity all in one go. And yeah, thanks to a plastic bag, and that really inspired me when I was writing my book, Hunger Pains, like Inside Food Bank Britain, which came out in 2016. So I was continuing to research food banks, and after reading Andy's book, which you might have seen the picture come up on here, where Andy's book is full of all these little sticky notes. So I sent a photo of that to Andy and was like, oh, I think we need to talk. We need to be discussing more. Just to really share in terms of what's happening in the UK, sort of thinking about the dangers of what we were seeing happen in our context, but also that shared learning piece. I think at that time in the UK, it's quite interesting that we were having a narrative around food banking coming from like the Trust and others that was talking about like food bank exit strategies and thinking about how we can work our way out of this, which I think was something of interest when I got in touch with with all of you guys. I read Andy's book, and then I thought, well, it'd be great to bring everyone together in one place. So I got a small amount of funding. We planned a 2-day conference in Birmingham in November 2018. And so that was to bring together like academics like Jan and Graham Riches, who've been doing this work for quite some time. But it was also about bringing together a lot of early career researchers and PhD researchers as well, because they were just starting off on their research journeys to think, well, these are people who are probably going to be researching charitable food and food insecurity for some time. But it was also about bringing together, people like Alison and Andy, people who were working like in non-profit and third sector organisations, to think about how we can come together, not just with academics, but also it was important for me to bring together like grassroots researchers and activists, people with lived experience of poverty as well. So there was about 45 of us over 2 days, and we just shared all of our work. And at the end of it, we were like, well, there's still so much we want to learn from each other and share. So how can we keep it going? So we sort of left it at that. That was like November 2018. We had this, desire to keep connecting and keep talking, but it wasn't actually until March 2019, a few months later, when the Global Food Banking Network announced they were having their first ever conference in London. So normally they would have that conference in America. So we thought, oh, this is interesting. They're coming to London. They're going to be bringing together some of the key charities in the UK, some of the huge corporate supermarkets. So that really sort of, I think, was the point where it galvanized us to come together, wasn't it? And we came together and wrote a letter, an open letter in the Guardian, and published that. So I think that was, the sort of moment when we actually became more of a collective.
So we began to really formalize right at the top of the pandemic when it was now announced. Is when the GSA really began to formalize a bit and actually come up with a name. And Charlie and Josh, could you talk a little bit about some of the evolution of that organization and some of the outputs and the things that we were actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting actually just listening and realising that on the book tour that Andy did, Andy came to Manchester and spoke to some of the people where I was, but I was still feeling quite disconnected from, I think it's just one of those points where if there are other people kind of doing similar things to you, if you're feeling isolated, try reaching out, because there are often people who are thinking about things. And I think we've emerged from these moments like the Global Food Banking Network conference happening in London, which were opportunities to kind of really start thinking about a shared analysis. And I think the pandemic created a moment where those of us who had the privilege to shelter in place were kind of able to come to an organizing space on Zoom and start really developing that shared analysis, but using some of these techniques like putting open letters to newspapers to try and be an outpiece for some of the things that we were thinking about. So yeah, I think we as a lot of movements go through, we started to think about, oh, we need working groups that are thinking about particular things. So I think it was probably around May that people started thinking about particular things, and we had a communications group. And actually, this reminds me of a session I was in this morning on Palestine, where there was a mention of kind of ideas about free speech and democracy, but where there are journalists being killed, I think it's always worth remembering the privilege that we have to be able to put words out there, even when sometimes it can feel pretty useless, or the mainstream media is problematic, etc. So yeah, communications is one of those things that can sound a bit boring, but is actually really important. So we were thinking about different methods of communicating some of the things that we were thinking about in our meetings. I don't really know where the idea for a podcast came about, but it was trying to, I think, start thinking about political education within food banks. We don't often hear from those who are using food banks, but we were really trying to work out, who's represented in this gathering space that we were starting to have. Like, do we have people from food banks working on the front lines? Do we have people who are using food banks with experience of food insecurity? So the podcast was a way to start kind of mapping out some of the themes that we were discussing, and a team. None of the others are here, but it was Christina Wong, Audrey Tung, who else? Suzanne Babb, yeah, and Rebecca D'Souza got together. So it was a woman-led team, and we also had the privilege of some paid time for an experienced comms worker from Duke University to help us with production and editing of a podcast, which turns out is quite a lot of work and skill. So it's one of those projects that I think we had even bigger visions for, and we could still be doing it. But it's one of those tasks that makes you realize the limits of your capacity. But yeah, Josh is going to play our teaser episode, which we workshopped for quite a long time to try and bring together all of the disparate issues that we were all circulating around.
Welcome to Rights Not Charity. This podcast series is about a big idea, ensuring that everyone has enough food, not as a charitable gift, but as a fundamental human right. We are the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice. We're a growing collective of food bank workers, researchers and public policy advocates, and this podcast represents our voice.
Have you ever wondered why there are so many food banks in rich countries? How do nations come to see food charity as a normal and necessary response to poverty and food insecurity? Food insecurity is a much bigger problem than food banks could ever solve. We need a transformative solution to food insecurity that's rooted in more than charity. But let's understand how we got here.
40 years ago, food banks exploded across the United States. They quickly spread to Canada and more recently to the UK. The food bank model is promoted as a win-win solution to both hunger and food waste in over 100 countries now. But we disagree, and here's why. The causes of hunger are complex and can't be solved simply by redirecting excess food.
Our food system is rooted in ongoing legacies of white supremacy, power, and domination, from settler colonialism and land dispossession to plantation slavery and industrial agriculture. The food system doesn't serve everyone equally. It makes our bodies sick and damages our soil and water. Hunger is rooted in much larger systems of inequity, including structural poverty and systemic racism. Hunger is an equity problem, not a problem of food supply.
Access to good food is a human right, and public policy should protect this basic right. But the food system is controlled by corporations motivated by profit, not rights. Corporations have been a powerful driver and beneficiary of the food charity system. We'll shine a light on the impact of corporate control of our food system.
Our Alliance is advocating for transformative solutions to the unjust conditions that cause hunger, food insecurity, and ill health. Tune in as we share those ideas. In the Rights Not Charity podcast series, we'll hear from a range of diverse voices. We'll learn about grassroots action and social movements, as well as policy interventions, legal mechanisms, and more. We want to shift the conversation from food charity to food justice to end breadlines for good. Follow our work and join our movement at rightsnotcharity.org. Let's recognize food as a pathway to health, justice, and healing. Solidarity, not charity. Human rights, not bragging rights. Political will, not liberal.
A few people have pointed out the jauntiness as being a little bit jarring, but I felt that there's limitations on the music you can use. What's something we talked about for a while? Just a couple more bits to say about that. So Christina Wong is the last voice you heard there, was working at Northwest Harvest in Seattle at that time. And it's hard sometimes to know the impact of some of these outputs that you have. But she would send some podcast episodes to members of her team. And, you know, she had really good conversations as a result of that. I think one of the ideas was that maybe people who are starting out volunteering in food banks might be able to listen to some of the explainer podcasts. But, and I don't know how effective that has been, but it was a very enjoyable process in many ways. And I think it was partly trying to bring complex and difficult ideas into language that wouldn't alienate the people who are working on the ground and coming to this critique from different places. And yeah, as I say, it takes quite a lot of work to produce a sort of 15-minute podcast that you've scripted and organized. But now we have gone for a bit more of a kind of rough cut way of, I guess, creating transparency to our discussions. So we record our meetings. And are they online?
It will be.
Okay. The plan is so that, which is a much easier and cheaper way to be making your discussions transparent, is to be recording your meetings and putting them online. It is a thing that can be done. So that's the podcast.
And all the podcasts are still.
The podcasts are online. Yeah.
And on Spotify, Apple Play, all those places. And
Yeah.
I do, you know, the jingle, it is meant for a certain audience of largely women stocking shelves in rural urban pantries all around the country, the world now. You know, we wanted to make it accessible, but also speak truth through it. And what I want to say about the pandemic is that it was also this moment of global reckoning, right? We had in the US especially a conversation, very important conversation about racial justice reckoning, while our food supply chains were basically breaking down. Everything that Jan talked about in the 1930s, with slaughtering pigs and pouring kerosene on oranges and plowing under, all of these absurdities were coming to the surface again. And actually in the lead up to the pandemic, the Trump administration and the China trade war spat had created way too much soy in the US food economy, which was being rediverted to pigs, right? And so in 2020, we also had massive amounts of pork circulating in these food bank systems while more and more folks were losing jobs and lining up. And we all saw those images of, you know, cars lining up across freeways waiting for a box of food. And so I think the fact that this organization started happening in 2016, and I don't want to say that the pandemic was serendipitous, but in a way, the pandemic forced a galvanization of this conversation at a global level. And as Charlie said, the regular meetings on Zoom were our new reality. So it did galvanize us as a group to really think about narrative change and what is going on in the dominant narrative and how do we counter it. And one of the things I just come out of studying is that the dominant narrative around charity is that it's demand driven. People are hungry, so they go to a food pantry. But if you actually look at what is producing these networks, it is supply driven. And it has always been supply driven. So what does that mean in a context where there is still demand for food, but we're resolving the demand through a supply fix, and a very inefficient one, inadequate one at that. We were also really concerned by the space that the global food banking network was occupying in this discussion, the way that they were very rapidly reshaping food waste laws in many countries across the world and how well resourced they were. So I think it was $10,000 that produced podcasts, the videos, the Global Food Banking Network has 40 full-time paid employees. Okay, so when we're talking about counter narratives, it's like people have time to organize in their cubicles in Chicago. So what in how do we counter this massive organization while also, and we'll get into this later, doing our day jobs. So the pandemic allowed us to be flexible in our day jobs, right? I mean, maybe I'm teaching differently, and at least for me, it allowed me to dedicate more time to the GSA than I would have perhaps in another situation. The philanthropy question was a very big one at that time, and we, along with Charlie was producing the podcast, and I was really trying to work through how do we fund food banks, how do we fund charities, and trying to shift the narrative around that. So the philanthropy letter was, I think, another galvanizing moment for us, which then required a website in a sense. Like I remember putting that letter out and we didn't have a website yet. So the actions themselves require the new actions, right? And we don't always exactly know where we're going, but by acting, the hope is that the possibility will be that we can continue to act. So
I think you should say what the philanthropy letter was.
yes, the philanthropy letter, which you can find on the website, was a call to philanthropists to reckon with the way that they have historically funded organizations on short-term contracts, also the equity question on who they are funding. You need a 501c3 status to receive funding, right? And a lot of the groups that we were hearing from, those that were creating during the pandemic, mutual aid networks, et cetera, could not get the funds. All of the funds were being channeled, into these existing food banking institutions. Jeff Bezos's ex-wife started a massive philanthropy and just dropped money bombs all across the food banking network, right? Which reorganized power relations within those networks all of a sudden. Certain actors are getting big pots of money and others are scrambling to recover waste from a dumpster. Like, is that the kind of future that we want to be building? And so really challenging the philanthropies themselves to reckon with, well, what is it that you're funding here? And we're able to organize a webinar with, I think it was about 50 to 70 US funders around this conversation that has started to percolate to where West Virginia Philanthropy just reached out and I was able to send their letter, and they want a keynote at this year's conference with people on the front lines of food insecurity, meaning having experienced food insecurity, and how can we actually fund what you're doing in your community. So slow incremental change, but hopeful narrative change.
Haley, maybe you want to add a little bit to this conversation, just not necessarily tied to the pandemic, but what was sort of the membership, what was the evolution of the membership and participation?
Yeah, and I actually think the pandemic is still important here. So if we remember actually sort of right at the start of the pandemic, a lot of the people who were working in like the frontline organizations like Northwest Harvest, etc., I think they found our calls quite a space for solidarity and sharing with each other. So we would, people would come together and say, well, we feel like we've been pushed back to like the 1980s in terms of the work we're trying to do. We've been trying to focus on like social justice work for so long, but now because of the huge need that we're facing, we just have to give food out as quickly as possible. So I think people found the GFA calls quite a space to say, well, oh, this is what I'm doing and this is the challenges that I'm facing. And it was sort of became this space for people to share. I think, in terms of how the memberships evolved over time, I think it was interesting actually just listening to the podcast teaser because it reminded me of the people who aren't actually involved anymore. And I think especially for the people who are working in the frontline organisations now, we've seen in the last sort of 18 months or so, we haven't had as much of that participation as we did before, and we're trying to think about how we can, invite people back in. But I think, just reflecting on actually the huge need that we've seen grow since COVID, I think everybody thought, oh wow, we're not this need we're seeing in COVID is, it's unprecedented, but then we've kept seeing more unprecedented events every single year. You know, we keep seeing further rises in food insecurity and in that need. So I think, you know, from what I've seen in my research over the last few years, which actually I got some funding back in October 2020 to partially to develop some of this GSA work. So I've been doing visits in the US, Canada, Europe. Haven't done as many in the UK, but I do need to do some more visits in the UK. Yeah, so I think part of that has been like visiting different organisations, and I think a sort of common theme that I've seen is really just this, you know, huge burnout in terms of volunteers and you know, the need that they're trying to meet, which just feels never ending. So I think it's, you know, it's obvious when we think why people can't take like 90 minutes out of their you know, out of their schedule once a month to meet with us. But I do think there was a value in that, and we are trying to think through how we can you know, how we can think about that, and also thinking about diversifying who's involved in conversations, and we're doing that in a meaningful way, and like Charlie said as well, in a way that makes sense to people, you know. So sometimes we find that we're a lot of academics on the call, so we don't want to be, you know, using language that actually doesn't make sense or doesn't resonate with people. So I think there are those sort of tensions, and, you know, trying to create a space that people feel, you know, people feel is a useful space, but it's a space that they sort of feel safe in, feel comfortable in, and want to come to every month.
That's a nice segue. I want to talk a little bit about challenges in this kind of organizing work, and challenges that we've experienced in particular as the GSA. And Josh, you touched on this a little bit around funding and how do we sustain the work without dedicated staff. There's, you know, and maybe just address that a little bit. And then I have a question for Alana and then one for Char.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we're all poaching time from our respective institutions. But Kaylee's Lever Hume Foundation grant has been really helpful because Kaylee is pretty much free to travel and be the connective tissue. You know, we've seen each other in different parts of the world. Kaylee got to come to West Virginia. She did a US tour. I think having the funding to meet in person is important. At the same time, we talk about, well, we need a countermap to the Global Food Banking Network, which is put out by Harvard Food Policy Law School, right?
Yeah.
And they're funded by Walmart. And they have money to do this stuff. And we need money to do that. We have resources, students, grad students willing to lean in, but we need to fund them. And the funding landscape for transnational, transatlantic work is not, too easy to come forward. Like you write the Ford Foundation, like, hey, here's our website. Like you need these connections to people that also understand the problem and the narrative that we're trying to change. But I think it's also sustaining in what, you know, solidarity means for us academics is actually poaching time, working uncompensated, unrecognized labor that is also part of action research and long-term accompaniment of a process and of a movement. And I think all of us here could speak differently to what that means on our personal lives and trajectories. But for me, at least, the GSA, all of the labor has been worth it because it creates meaning to the research and actually continues to create new avenues for research, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and before I turn to Alana, I just want to do a shout out to Wide Hunger, which is a nonprofit organization based in New York City that provided the original funding and fiscal sponsorship to help us get going. So it wasn't a university, it was a nonprofit organization that does some re-granting that was really critical. That Alana,
Anna, can you comment this, because I think the dwindling of our frontline food bankers and it is evidence that our project, our organization, has done a better job of meeting the needs of academics than it has of meeting the needs of people. And that has to do with the publisher parish. And we, it's poached time in some ways, Joshua, but for many of us, it contributes to being able to write useful, creative, acceptable things. So we probably need to have an analysis that lets us understand what kinds of activities would provide similar supports, benefits to people. Because I really loved the interaction with people who were struggling with the day-to-day realities. Within the broader food bank network in the US, there's always been a subset of progressive people who wanted to shorten the lines and not just keep finding more food to eat. And so I hope we can find ways to be useful enough to them that come back in.
Alana, want to talk, ask if you could talk a little bit from your personal experience about negotiating the tension between grassroots organizing and.
Yeah, so I came into this space a little bit later than the most junior scholar here. I was in graduate school. Let's see. Graduate. But yeah, so I think I've been working on research in food banks for 8 years now, but I've also done research on experiences with scholar activism, sort of the barriers there. And I've seen in this group a lot of those same tensions that are present in other parts of scholar activism. So there's like these, just as Jen was saying, there's these disconnects between what each sort of institution needs, people in that need to continue their jobs that they are getting paid to do. And then there's also these tensions between the timelines is a huge one. As academics, we have the luxury of studying food banks for 8 years versus people on the ground faster timeline than we are. So I think some of those things, as I came into the group, was kind of as the sort of on the ground providers really started dwindling. So we saw some of those things, and then it was changing. I think too, I'm wondering about, we have jobs that are flexible and allow us to work more remotely, but if they deploy back into the office, I kind of talked about what was coming up today for me. And then we've also sort of recognized just sort of like the geographical limitations of trying to organize and make this work, particularly as we try to manage across a wide variety of time zones. So I have been in California, and we've got people in Europe. And so we've got people in Europe who are working after hours. I'm waking up early to before 12 Andy. And so those time frames can really make it difficult. We tried to include people in Asia for an event, but the timeline is just not feasible on the West Coast. So we really sort of had run into some of these barriers with both these scholar activist tensions of like, what are we doing and who is that benefiting? Like we're trying to counter this narrative around charity, but what are also the tangible benefits to each person participating in their own work? And then also sort of just these geographical and technical issues of how do we get people from all over the world onto a call at the same time? And we've largely been working with English-speaking countries because we're conducting our meetings in English. So some of the limitations of that translation as in larger events.
So I'm going to move this along towards talking a little bit about impact, but before that, I'm wondering, one thing I'm not sure we've made incredibly clear is that we really are organizing together as folks who are living in wealthy but unequal countries. So, and I wonder if someone might want to speak to that. Why are we doing that, and what does that have? How are we connecting and building allyship and with folks in Kosovo?
I suspect some of us would have different responses to this. We've kind of hinted at how the Global Food Banking Network has had a bit of an expansionist view of how food banks might move into different contexts. And its map that Josh mentioned was kind of looking at how policies in particularly middle-income countries might be barriers to redistributing wasted food. I don't call it food waste. I guess we kind of saw ourselves as trying to be a sort of mirror process for this recognition that there is a model of industrializing food production, supermarketization that produces the kinds of levels of corporate waste that make food banks a useful institution in the countries where food is either being extracted via the cheapened labor and ecological resources of other places, or it has, industrial agriculture to be able to do that itself and generate giant surpluses like the US. So I guess that's one, is that there is an expansion of a particular model of agriculture that suits a food banking model. And so we've been trying to respond to that, and perhaps us grappling with that global context makes it a little alienating for some of the people working in a national context or a local context, wanting to come to meetings and find something relevant for their context. So maybe there's a bit of a mismatch there. And I guess there has been an analysis that, Jan's book looks at, Graham Richards has been looking at around austerity and the attacks on models of democratic welfare states, I guess. And so how there have been these parallel processes of reducing people's capacity to feed themselves in collective or state-backed ways that have demanded a response. And when we have the right to food has been another framework that I think we've grappled with around, whether that offers an alternative model to the charitable model that has been represented as as Jan mentioned, the tooth-birth solution. Oh, like we've got massive waste problem, growing hunger problem. Let's just redistribute the waste. So yeah, I don't know if you have bits to add to that, to the context.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say in very non-academic terms that we also, I think, felt this obligation to kind of own our own bullshit, right? In the way that we've contributed in these wealthy unequal countries to the struggles that are happening around the world in less wealthy countries, and that we tend to show up as the extractor of knowledge, as the studying the other, being in solidarity with, but maybe not real solidarity, and not even acknowledging that there's hunger in our own country. And so wanting to in some ways figure out how to be in solidarity with each other around confronting our own confronting the structures and systems that are keeping folks hungry in the US as a way of showing up differently. The US tends to be the one who's blocking international law. The US tends to be the one, in fact, the Global Food Banking Network was launched by America, which is time, I guess, the Second Harvest. So these kinds of things to really do some of our own analysis, so that we can connect more deeply and more authentically with folks.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is just raising a warning flag to these social movements that we're also during the pandemic confronting the need to have emergency food-like situations, right? There were new conditions of people not being able to access food, and the model that seemed to make sense was this redistribution. And corporations saw that as an opportunity, and we're just trying to raise a red flag, like, do not do what we did, like, and it is coming. Be careful. And I think that's our role as well from the global board.
Andy.
No, I was just going to say, the colonial mindset is that people in rich countries or the advanced countries have things to learn, things to teach to those who are in lesser developed countries. And we've been responsible. I'll flip that on its head, and that the US has exported a terrible model around the world. So we do not have the responsibility to try to undo the harm that we do.
So following on that, Andy, how do you maintain hope and focus on progressive realization of justice?
I mean, I see it depends on the day, right? I mean, some days yes, and some days no. I do see a lot of narrative change happening, whether, you know, there's large counter trends. There's large trends, you know, towards food banks becoming more wealthy. I did analysis and found that the food banks in the Feeding America network, while 200 of them are $4 billion richer in net assets now than weren't before the pandemic, because of Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Bezos and everybody else who threw a lot of money down that avenue. But at the same time, I'm seeing a lot more of the charitable food system starting to at least acknowledge some of the more root causes and some of the deeper issues. Whether they're able to act on them or not is an issue. But I think that the cultural hegemony of what's possible in our world is really important. And we start to question whether food banking is a good thing. I think that is good.
Alana is sort of as you said, the newest and greenest and youngest among us, at least here today. Can you talk a little bit about what you should hope as you launch into this career?
Yeah, I think I read everyone who's worked here as I was coming into this, and I had done some work in food banks myself before. Like I had done a community engaged project with one food bank, looking at barriers to access, saw a lot of inequitable systems. And then I turned to this national research interviewing food bank CEOs during the pandemic, and I talked to 62 different bank leaders across the US. And it wasn't in all of them, but in a growing minority, I started to see sort of these broader connections to the food justice movement, as well as other discussions of systemic oppression and inequity. And I think food banks, at least some of them, are starting to own up to their histories of how they've supported the corporate food system and how they've perpetuated resources going to more white people than other groups. And so some of them are starting to counter those narratives. There's been work at several food banks to support living wage initiatives, both within food banks and outside. So I see hope there. I think there's also struggles though too. There's boards retaliating back, firing people who implemented those policies. There's donors pulling out. But I think most of the food banks who at least have a supportive board were able to say that when they shifted towards these more politicized narratives that question the current system, they were able to find donors. And I looked at their financial data, and they did continue, despite after making these controversial decisions, they still brought in more resources than the year before. So I think there's some hope there that I don't think US food banks are going to play at this point, but maybe they could become more sites of change and not what a food bank has been.
So I want us to go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just before we went on to sort of wrap it up, I just wanted to say as well, like examples, like for example, the Scottish Government last year in June became the first government in the world to publish a plan on actually ending the need for food banks. And so it's quite a important moment there in terms of they're committed to what we call a cash first approach. So the idea is that instead of people who are experiencing food insecurity, instead of their first port of call being a food bank, there are sort of these other steps, such as like local welfare assistance in terms of the form of cash grants that people can access. So then the food bank really does become like an emergency. So the Scottish Government have been funding a lot of these like cash first pilots that have been developed in collaboration with food banks and with people working on the ground with the Independent Food Aid Network IFAN, who I mentioned before. So I think that's interesting as well in terms of if you have got governments who are sort of willing to think about what it would take to actually work towards, actually eradicating the need for food banks. I think that is actually something that is hopeful and something that we can think about and learn.
So while you're there, why don't you tell us how
Oh, we can engage, yeah. Well, obviously you can go to our website, rightsnotcharity.org. Or if you would like to join, we have got a Google listserv group where we share details of our upcoming meetings. We also share, interesting articles and information. So if you want to be added to that, you can get in touch with me. I can share my email on the slides. You can get in touch with me and I can add you to the list. But yeah, we would love to have more people getting involved and joining us. Meet on the first Thursday of every month at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT. So yeah, we meet every month for 90 minutes. So yeah, we would love to have more people get involved, and if there's anyone else who might be interested in being involved, please do share our website, and yeah, we'd love to welcome more people.
Can you explain that we have presentations from far and
Yeah.
wide at these meetings?
Yeah, so we tend to start each meeting with like a 45-minute shared learning spotlight. So, for example, last month we invited somebody from the Basque Country in Spain to come and talk about the new food waste laws in Spain. So we try and get engaged with people who are working in different parts of the world and find out what's happening and how we can learn from that and how we can share and get involved. So yeah, we tend to have those, and like we said earlier, those are recorded and they will be going up on the website once we figure out all the logistics and the transcriptions, etc.
So I want to give Jan a few minutes to wrap up, but before that, I'm wondering if you guys could just briefly shout out, what are we working on now? Yes. Gosh.
Well, we're working on another brief. The Rights Not Charity brief was translated in 3 languages in conjunction with FIAN, and we had like, I think 150 people from the Global Network for the Right to Food tune in, which was a moment of
250.
250, okay. So this was really the kind of like, here's the analysis, and then, we had folks from Southeast Asia and East Africa speak back to the brief. That was Rights Not Charity. The next one we're working on is what's the problem with feeding food waste to the poor? Just basically like what's going on with this food waste problem. And hoping, yeah, and the root cause, like the political economy of waste, basically. So we're hoping that will be published this fall, and then again, the global network. We can continue to have that conversation. And what these policy briefs are important for is also UN spaces, like at the FAO, which is being captured by the Global Food Banking Network. We are thinking a lot about global governance and shifting the conversation in these spaces in Rome when people are meeting and making the rules of our global food order.
Oh, and then another initiative we're working on is sort of a counter mapping initiative. So Josh talked earlier about the map put out by the Global Food Banking Network. So we're trying to imagine sort of the critical mapping space, what sort of counter maps we might want to make, and also what we have the resources and time to make. If anyone else wants to get involved with that as well. We're thinking of how we can highlight non-charitable solutions, as well as maybe just sort of like re-envisioning that from an asset map to maybe making there's a deficit map. Things like that. So sort of reframing that work and what it means to map differently.
Among other things, other things are in the works, and we need your ideas and your participation in that as well. So we're going to move to questions, but or comments. Before that, I want to ask how many of you have read Sweet Charity, Jan's book? Sweet Charity is 40 years old, and right,
40%, 25.
How long?
Yeah,
I was thinking about 25 years old, and Jan has agreed to give us a little bit of quarter century.
I was at one other talk where the facilitator asked that question, and only one person. But still, Anyway, what can I say? Thank you. I'm humbled. But I wish I felt like I had some sort of wonderful words of wisdom that comparable to my advanced age that I could offer. But I don't, because I think we are facing challenges in global warming, polarization and erosion of democracy, reliance on violence that are so huge that it's hard to keep working. It's hard not to go watch stuff on TV. And I think our little network, which we're still pretty network, although if you won't. It helps keep us in the fight, it helps keep us going. And if this network can do that for you, then come and join us. But if it can't, find one that can. Very few of us have the stamina and internal resources to keep struggling against these massive disruptions of global life. One by one, or two by two. So I found a community. One of the other reasons you ask people why they say, and for me, it's been a way to have some interactions with younger people who are thinking about the same issues. It's been great once you stop teaching. One downside, you don't have to grade papers, which is great. But a true downside is that stimulating input from young creative minds. So I encourage you to find your community. I hope you'll give us a try. But if you're not it, if the right to practice, the community of practice is another way into this space that's less academic, and maybe you want to explain how people can get in touch with so I want to say that, and then I want to say, I think when we are engaged in our critique, we have to be sure that we do not undervalue the work of people who are out there in the communities, on the front lines, stocking the shelves, gleaning fruits and vegetables. The Right to Food Summit wowed me with the creativity and innovation that's going on out there. People are moving beyond let's see if the grocery store will give us the best that's used by, or nearing the best that's used by date, to places where people are indeed growing food. So I think in our critique, we need to honor the work that's being done, and we need to be cognizant of the desperation of people who must rely on it. One of the things we should learn from the pandemic is that programs that provide decent income supports, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, they make a real difference in the levels of food insecurity. So when we would have expected food insecurity to jump, it didn't, but the profit went down. When they terminated those programs, and this is specifically the US context, when they terminated those programs, it began to rise again. And in the UK, I mean, my biggest takeaway from interaction in the UK was when you lost your welfare state infrastructure, with universal predicate, I don't know the technical terms, but it was really restricted and designated, and yes, that produces urgent, immediate need. So we have to find a way to continue our critique, to continue to hold up rights. And rights not charity. I love our hashtag. So simple. But to think in terms of the different forms of governance for the food banking networks, because as Alana said, we're not going to overnight. We're not Scotland. And, and we're not going to do away with food banks, food banking in the United States, but we may be able to transform. I always thought that huge horde, that army of good people trying to meet needs with resources that lay their hands on was a kind of sleeping dragon in the United States. And if we could awaken it, we could change the politics. That's what I want to save our democracy.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. So we do have a little bit of time, and Tatiana can hand this up, and you can either make a comment or you can ask a question for whatever.
Yeah, I have a question for the group. First, just to be totally honest, I am a beneficiary of Mackenzie Scott dumping money on food banks, and my food bank had so much money they didn't know what to do with it. They created an innovation lab and hired some researchers for a few years, and then kind of realized those researchers were kind of upsetting or moving us along. So I'm on the market. As someone who I feel almost like a double agent, having spent 2 years researching inside a food bank, and I really agree with you, Alana, about how you see that tension playing out every day between the promise of transformation, the individuals who believe in transformation, and then the kind of corporate control and business as usual. And so I just wanted to ask to see, like, if there's diversity of opinion or where people are on this kind of larger idea of the nonprofit industrial complex, and if not, but some people say nonprofits are not part of the movement, like they can't be. So I'm just curious if you all share Alana's kind of charitable viewpoint, to use a term, the possibility that food banks can be an agent of change or even dragged along on a spectrum of change, or if you think that the structure of food banking and large nonprofit organizations in the United States is a fundamental barrier to rights. You want to take that up, Andy? No?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully there will be a paper for you to read shortly titled Abolish the Food Bank, Long Live the Food Bank, toward a Planetary Food Commons, that Charlie and I labored over for the last 4 years. Our co-authors are food bankers and community organizers in the anti-hunger space. And that paper emerged from debates in the GSA. Basically, like, do we end this thing or do we leverage this massive infrastructure of people and resources and infrastructures, and really thinking about Ruthie Gilmore's theories of abolition as being complicated within our own presence and positionalities, needing to understand the past that brought us here, but also create opportunities for imagining a new future out of the violent past. And so I am more, in my own local organizing, hopeful that more and more people are identifying as abolitionist food bankers, that I am actually continuing to work here as an abolitionist for a different food banking future. They're encountering, tensions with that. But then they're also organizing and forming labor unions within a food bank. They are shaping the way that funds fund communities, right? So if it took us a century since the Agricultural Adjustment Act that set into motion all of these things, because one thing we didn't talk about is that TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, is the basis for food banks existing. Anchors them. It's a federal program. It's going to take another 50 at least, right, to unwind us. So I think we need to be adopting this dual mode of abolition and transformation. And that's my position.
I would say that, just to answer your question, that we, it feels to me like we're all about holding conversations, that we're sort of, this is where we are. We can't, as Jan said, very eloquently, we're not dismantling things tomorrow. so much need. And we believe that ultimately it's not the kind of society that the world of want to live in. So how can we kind of progressively move towards that? And I think we've all got different ideas and different strategies and I think we're saying, let's bring them all on and let's make the road more walking in many ways. And I also agree very much with Jan that there is this untapped political power among volunteers in food banks. Right now, most food banks treat volunteers as a bit of a cult of the volunteer, they're the heroes in the food banks. And while those volunteers are needed, are they really the protagonists in that story?
Yeah, I just want to add to that, just directly on that point about sort of like political education and politically mobilizing volunteers. So in the UK, I think it's about 18 months ago now. So like I found the Independent Food Aid Network together with the Trussell Trust, who are the largest franchise, and an organisation called Feed in Britain. They got together like 3,000 volunteers and workers, and they did an open letter to the Prime Minister, basically saying, we're stressed, we're overworked, we're burnt out, we, have to ration food. And then a group of them went, directly at 10 Downing Street to do some of that, work. I saw actually just this morning, there's been a letter to the Prime Minister by a lot of IFM members being sent. So they do a lot of that, sort of, coming together and trying to, use the power that is, in the just thousands and thousands of mainly volunteers who are sort of propping up the system. So I think, there are some good examples of what that can look like.
Just one comment I want to make about philanthropy as a field is that philanthropy itself is dependent on inequality. And inequality has been growing at, pell-mell. I mean, when I was writing Sweet Charity, I was talking about how much it increased, but it's what it was then is dwarfed by what's happening now. So we need to address the inequality in wealth and income. And philanthropy will consequently shrink some. And that is of course a challenge that we don't have very many models of doing it successfully in fully capitalist countries.
I'm just going to pay this one. Yeah, just to try to answer your question. I don't think that what the main reason behind food banks not being able to be leaders in the revolution, for lack of a better way to put it, is because they're embedded in the nonprofit industrial complex. I mean, there's some of that, for sure, but I think nonprofits can play an important role in social change. But I think it's food banks by design. Who funds them, their connections to industry, the fact that they're just downstream appendages, in my opinion, is really what holds them back from transforming themselves. I mean, I see lots of transformation. I see lots of change around the edges. I see even, Oregon Food Bank making statements about there needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza now. But at the same time, I see change around public health, around development, but they're still very much embedded in that kind of corporate food system model, and I don't see them being able to get themselves out of that very much. But I think that's just because of who they are and how they've been created, not because of nonprofits.
I think that, we know that more than 50% of people that use food banks on a regular basis have at least one full-time working adult in their household. And so my question is, why aren't they, they do a lot of advocacy around SNAP, why aren't they advocating for privacy? And that's I'm sorry. You had your hand up, I apologize. Go ahead.
I know the answer to that question. My name's Hannah, I work at Feeding America. Thank you all for your work. We don't advocate for that because food banks don't pay a living wage. So we can't be on the Hill advocating for a living wage when not all of our members are paying that. And we are doing work internally to try to get food banks.
I would go a step further, because I work at a food bank where everyone does get a living wage, but our food bank won't take part in advocacy because our grocery store donors do not pay a living wage.
And I think there's a challenge with, like, Oregon is always out front doing incredible. They're really great. And then we have food bank CEOs who don't believe in SNAP or government assistance at all and only want the charitable food system. So trying to come up with advocacy plans that take into account all of this and move forward is, I'm really glad I'm not team on to say that. But I also think, Jan, earlier you said something about you had more food bankers involved previously. Food bank budget, the cost of food is going up, and so food banks are actually laying off a lot of staff right now, and they're laying off permanent staff. The staff was probably involved in keeping the people who are bringing in food, which I think is gonna set us back, because a lot of the conversations we were having that were moving in the direction you all are now being put on pause because to figure out how to operate on deficit budgets.
You know, there's a lag because we're still reacting to what we can't see.
Yeah.
But what did you call them? Money bomb?
Money bomb.
Yeah, and so the images that you're, the banks are swimming in dough, but.
And we're not. We were.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's had it in West Virginia too, which is like a constant cycle of boom and bust. Like, my first food banking paper was when Mountaineer Food Bank had laid off all of their staff. They were about to shut down because they could no longer operate. And 450 food pantries were freaked out. You know, and that full-time staff was still volunteering just to make it happen. That was 2014. Where by 2019, they now have 70 staff. But you can already see it going like, oh shoot, you know, what are we gonna do? And the food question is also like, they're constantly readapting to supply chain changes. So where what tanked them in 2014 was Feeding America saying, agency-enabled pickups. Now you're not getting the food here, you have to go get it. We're a rural state, right? So they're adapting to these supply chain pressures, and now you have less TPAP food, prices going way up. So really talking about food supply chains and food banks is, I think, important because supply chains is the capitalist food system that we're all confronting and presenting papers about. And how do we get that pedagogy and education within food bank workers to talk about?
I also think, to respond to there's a small but growing, I don't even think it's small. There's a growing group of food bankers who think that the way food banks operate. And I think that's growing. And I also think within the national office, that's growing a lot. And I think over the next few years, the way the national office operates is going to change pretty radically because of that. And I feel like I'm really defending Feeding America, and I'm actually a pretty huge critic of Feeding America. So I'm feeling very self-conscious right now about what I'm saying. But I think with food banks and yes, the donors are a challenge and change, and so are the boards. But I also think we're seeing people who are finally having the courage to stand up to their boards and stand up to their donors. And when that's happening, change is. Yeah. And they might lose donors, but they get other donors. Right. And so I think we finally have people who are able to do that with small pockets. It's not across the board, but I think as people see that being more successful, it's going to expand, and hopefully we may be able to advocate for legalization. We may be able to advocate for other policies in a way that.
Tell those bankers that you know that are agitating from the inside to join the National Food Community Practice.
I'm gonna send it out to my super.
Yeah, it's righttofoodus.org, and we are we are a shared learning space. We do have folks that are working in, there are members that are part of food banks. We have folks that are, organizing on the front lines, the whole spectrum, some academics, and the whole spectrum of folks that just hungry to have this conversation of how do we break the silence so that, we've got small farmers, we've got small farmer organizations, we have social movements, we have, economic justice folks that are all coming to the table to have this conversation and learn from people. Lauren.
My question is really about hierarchical structures. I'm wondering, how do you guys work? Who's in charge, who's not, and is that in food banks? Because often I meet food banks, there's one guy in a poorly or open suit who's in charge. Why does he get to decide all of these things that are, as we keep saying, people on the ground decisions? So I'm wondering how that isn't being talked about. The cooperative structure enables circular autonomy, democracy. It allows for a much more broad participation. The co-op that I run is much more like a cellular membrane. People can come in and out. There's mitochondria, right? There's like all of these ways in which people can easily come in. And so I'm wondering, how do you work? Are you a pyramid? Are you a flat structure?
That's a really good question. I think from the start, we didn't want to create like another sort of organization with hierarchical structures. We deliberately didn't want to do that. So, but we then found as we were going along, we didn't have anybody trying to make decisions. So we would have the meetings and then we'd be trying to like make sort of quite boring technical type decisions that were like then not interesting to some of the people coming along to the meetings. So we started to set up like a, on the third Thursday of every month, we have like a facilitation group. So that was people who, could spare and dedicate the time to actually thinking about some of those more boring decisions, but decisions that needed to be made around, some of the finance stuff or, just planning that type of stuff. So that group, we tried to sort of encourage other people to rotate it and get, different people involved with it. So I think that's, at the moment it's like Alison, me, Josh, and then Emily Tyson from Fian International. So we try and meet, and then it's not like we make the decisions, we'll chat about something, then we'll come back to the group and say, this is what we're thinking, what do you think about that? So just try to make it a bit more of a sort of.
So I think that's the touch point, right? So
Yeah.
food banks have learning circles. I'm not sure if anybody's read Collective Courage.
Yes.
Okay, but thinking really critically about that learning circle model and how who's making the decisions matter.
Yeah.
Even if it is what time the meeting is, even if it is who's taking notes and how, I think that a lot of what happens in food banks is that there's one guy who's deciding how the decisions are made. If we're going to defend our democracy, co-ops absolutely allow us to practice.
And if you get this suit fit well, then.
Feedback. So the last thing I'll say is the question around philanthropy. You had mentioned they need a keynote. Hi, I will keynote for them every minute. But also decolonizing wealth is really the next conversation with philanthropic thought. If you haven't read that book, that's really where trust-based philanthropy is going. And hearing a lot of essentially grant-based activism, we're saying scholar, but most of that coming from grants. So grant-based activism is always going to have an upper limit. And I think that upper limit comes to ahead with community-based funding. So why we're worried about donors because we haven't.
I'm gonna give the last question to Nina, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Alison. What a pleasure to be here in the same room with you. I'm coming from co-running an indigenous nonprofit for 15 years, working on the Dawn Autumn Nation in Western Pima County. And during the pandemic, so we were a food justice nonprofit, and during the pandemic, nobody else could step up but us. And we had a few weeks to turn around. We just had, a food incubator, and farmers connections. I gave all the partners their books to charity. What we did was we tried to go against this model, and it was awful. we had a huge pushback from regional food bank, and it didn't help when I refused to, rotten vegetables and sugary cereal for our indigenous population, who then, went behind our backs and politically lobby against us. Speaking about the philanthropy and the complexes. We did employ volunteers. We worked really hard to do that. And we did vouchers to the local grocery store. So Mr. Fisher, you did a talk on those vouchers. And during the pandemic, you were like a voice of reason because we didn't hear that in our area. And listening to your webinar, I sent it to all of our partners, trying to justify what we were doing was a good way to do it. So thank you. You were there with us, even though we didn't know. And a comment I wanted to make was other nonprofits. So not just food banks, but other nonprofits were a big pushback because it's not just philanthropy and charity in food systems. It's anything else that touches, including people, volunteer labor, donations, all of that. They didn't understand we're trying not to create dependency. And, I do not know, I don't have solutions for that, but when you're thinking about that, just understand, from the ground up, again, the food system touches on so many other systems. And, we are gonna have to change the way people really think of ourselves and power in general. So thank you so much for your work, and I can't wait to join. And thank you, Allison, for organizing that.
Great. Thank you all so much. Take care.